Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to embark on a journey, really try and uncover the intricate, often hidden mechanics of one of the vastest historical powers the world has ever known. Imagine peeling back layers of time to reveal not just events, but the deliberate strategies, the subtle manipulations, and the profound, lingering effects of a force that shaped a subcontinent for over 2 centuries. We're taking a deep dive into the truly complex art of British colonialism in India. Our mission is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge regarding the British colonial model. We'll be focusing specifically on three foundational pillars: the insidious strategy of divide and rule, the transformative and often damaging impact of colonial education, and the pervasive influence of British laws. It's about grasping not merely what occurred, but how this power was meticulously orchestrated and maintained, and crucially, how its echoes continue to resonate and shape present day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh.
Absolutely. And to truly understand the depth of this immense historical impact, we're going to employ a powerful analytical tool, Johann Galton's violence triangle framework. This isn't just about, physical harm. It helps us illuminate direct, structural, and cultural violence. It's a vital lens for revealing the deep, often invisible impact of colonial policies, and for understanding why these legacies aren't just historical footnotes, but living forces that continue to influence the subcontinent today.
Okay, let's unpack this fascinating history then and see how these different elements intertwined in a way that's still shaping lives. Our story begins, well, like many grand narratives do, with arrival. The origins of British colonialism in India, they can be traced back to 1757, when the British Navy and merchants first made their significant presence felt on the subcontinent. Now, India wouldn't officially become a crown colony until 1876, but the roots of this expansive colonial project, they stretch much, much further back. During the 1760s, a period marked by the gradual demise of the once mighty Mughal Empire, the British began systematically acquiring territory from the weakening Mughal emperor. This wasn't a sudden takeover, not at all. It was a complex, opportunistic process, heavily influenced by a mix of internal Indian conflicts and, while rapidly expanding external British ambitions. It was a strategic, almost predatory consolidation of power.
Exactly. And when we talk about colonialism, it's important to be precise about what we mean. At its core, it's defined as the conquest and control of other people's lands and goods, end quote. This goes far beyond just political domination. It fundamentally involves the forceful seizure of local land and economy, reshaping pre-existing non-capitalist economies, which often operated on different social and distributive principles, to aggressively fuel European capitalism. Mercantilism, that economics theory designed to maximize a nation's wealth through trade and accumulation, combined with aggressive political and military control, these were the relentless driving forces behind Britain's expansion in India. The depth of this penetration was extensive, aimed at nothing less than full economic and political control.
And right at the heart of this early, insidious expansion was the British East India Company, the EIC. By the 1660s, the EIC was already competing fiercely with other European powers, like the French, for a foothold in that lucrative Indian trade. What they quickly realized, and then expertly capitalized on, were the existing internal conflicts, the wars of succession, the intense rivalries among various regional Indian powers. They weren't confronting a unified entity, you see, but rather a rich tapestry of independent states. And their true brilliance and the ultimate tragedy wasn't simply conquering a united front.
No, it was their calculated genius in exploiting those pre-existing fault lines, turning India's vibrant diversity into its Achilles heel. That strategy would echo for centuries.
That's precisely where the story takes such a fascinating turn, isn't it?
It really does. This exploitation culminated in some truly pivotal moments on the battlefield. The 1757 Battle of Plassey and then the 1764 Battle of Buxar, these were absolute game changers. These victories didn't just give the British control, they allowed them to take full administrative control of Bengal, a region incredibly rich in resources. This wasn't merely about trade anymore, it gave them the right to collect revenues, essentially establishing their firm colonial domination, a massive shift from trading presence to direct rule. And while the British Crown established direct rule after the devastating 1857 mutiny, a pivot abandoning outright annexation to try and, curry favor with some native states, they explicitly reserved the right to intervene. They could step into any native states deemed treacherous to the Crown. This legacy of conditional autonomy, as we know, continues to be felt in places like Balochistan and Kashmir, where central authority intervening remains deeply contentious.
That conditional autonomy is key. And the journey from just a trading company to a true empire, it wasn't a sudden coup, was it? It was more a meticulous legislative process. Acts like the 1784 India Act and the 1813 Charter were effectively the legal scaffolding Britain used to dismantle local power, replacing it with a centralized administration. The 1784 India Act brought the EIC's sprawling activities under the direct supervision of the British Parliament. That signaled increasing, almost total direct involvement of the British state.
Right. And then the 1813 Charter didn't just implement a full colonial administration. It strategically separated the EIC's territorial and commercial jurisdictions. Basically, it transformed it from a trading company into a governing body. During this period, the EIC began appointing British ambassadors, establishing permanent factories, essentially fortified trading posts, and entrenching British settlements across India. By meticulously coordinating their economic and political objectives, Britain came to control an astonishing 680 princely states.
680, that's incredible.
It really is. And these weren't minor holdings. They constituted about 45% of the total area of British India, excluding Myanmar and Sindh, and encompassed a staggering 23% of the total population. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation of indigenous governance piece by piece, engineered to rule one of the largest colonies in terms of both land and population.
And a key aspect of cementing this control was introducing their own codified laws, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The British genuinely saw these laws as a means to ensure order, certainty, and uniformity, aligning with prevailing liberal ideas of the rule of law back in Britain. However, these same laws, while ostensibly creating uniformity, were also swiftly and ruthlessly employed against the local populace to suppress any uprisings or dissent. They were tools of control as much as tools of order. The British didn't stop there. They went as far as abolishing the historic Mughal court, removed three-quarters of the existing warlord aristocracy, and systematically eliminated many local feudal landowners. In their place, they established a British-style bureaucracy, staffed by new aristocrats who were incentivized to adopt a British lifestyle.
And this was accompanied by the aggressive introduction of the English language, its culture, its literature, its philosophy.
Exactly. All meticulously designed to strengthen Britain's power base, and perhaps most insidiously, to cultivate an elite class that was, as Macaulay famously put it, biologically Indian but culturally English. It was about creating a bridgehead of loyalty within the conquered population.
So that's the setup, a comprehensive picture of how British power was established. But you mentioned something intriguing earlier about the invisible violence of colonialism. How exactly does Galtung's framework help us uncover those less obvious forms of harm? What's the most surprising hidden impact you found it reveals?
It's a truly profound way to think about violence, actually. Johann Galtung, a pioneer in peace and conflict studies, defines violence not just as physical harm, but as the crushing of human potential. It's the difference between the life you could lead and the life you are forced to lead. Think of it like a society building invisible walls around people, limiting their dreams not through direct force, but through rigged systems and biased beliefs. This allows us to see beyond the obvious, beyond just the battles.
Fascinating. So, what are these three forms of violence he identifies, and how do they connect to colonialism specifically?
Galtung identifies three forms, and they're intricately linked, often feeding into each other. First, there's direct violence, which is the most visible and immediately recognizable. This includes physical harm like murder, assault, rape, torture, hate crimes, ethnic violence. These are the acts of aggression we typically associate with conflict. Colonialism, of course, was absolutely replete with direct violence in its conquests and suppression of rebellions.
Right, the obvious kind.
Then we move to the less obvious, but perhaps more pervasive structural violence. This is far less visible, often subtly woven into the very fabric of a society's systems and institutions. It arises from an uneven distribution of resources, opportunities, and power, caused by deep-seated social, political, and economic mechanisms. It's violence that isn't enacted by a specific person or group in a direct attack, but rather results from the way a society is structured, limiting life chances and perpetuating disadvantage.
Okay, so it's built into the system itself.
Precisely. And finally, we have cultural violence. This refers to aspects of culture itself, be it religion, language, symbols, or ideology, that are used to legitimize or justify direct and structural violence. It's the way narratives, beliefs, and even traditions are manipulated to make violence seem acceptable, necessary, or even natural. Like saying one group is inherently superior, or that certain practices are civilized while others aren't. What's truly illuminating here is how this framework allows us to see beyond obvious conflict, beyond just the battles and the physical oppression, and understand the systemic, often insidious ways colonialism caused harm and continues to do so in its aftermath.
And these forms are interconnected.
Absolutely. Intricately related. One often perpetuates or legitimizes another. For instance, direct violence, like conquest, can be used to create and entrench structural violence, like discriminatory laws or economic systems. And cultural violence, like racist ideologies or the denigration of local culture, can in turn maintain both direct and structural forms of violence, making them seem inevitable or even righteous.
This framework also helps us understand that critical difference between negative peace and positive peace, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. Negative peace is simply the absence of direct violence when the shooting stops, for instance. But positive peace goes much deeper. It's the absence of structural violence or social injustice. It implies genuine social justice, equity, and the full realization of human potential for everyone.
So the argument is, to achieve truly inclusive and just societies, we have to courageously explore our past and directly address this deep-seated legacy of colonialism, which continues to fuel conflicts today.
Precisely. This deep dive aims to show precisely how the British sustained their colonial presence through deliberate policies like divide and rule, through the very architecture of colonial education, and through discriminatory laws, all of which actively promoted these different yet interconnected forms of violence.
Okay, now let's turn to perhaps the most infamous and certainly one of the most devastating pillars of British colonial strategy: divide and rule. This wasn't some accidental byproduct of their presence, was it?
Not at all. It wasn't a spontaneous reaction either. It was a deliberate, meticulously implemented, and absolutely core strategy, designed specifically to provoke hostility and fragmentation within India's incredibly diverse population. It was, quite frankly, calculated chaos.
Particularly chaos, I like that.
Because they recognized India's vast sociocultural diversity early on, almost immediately, and they saw it not as the challenge to unify or integrate, but chillingly, as an immense opportunity to exploit. They intentionally used religion, particularly the historical distinctions and potential tensions between Hindus and Muslims, as a powerful wedge. This deliberate incitement, fanning pre-existing emperors into raging fires, led directly to the death and displacement of millions and widespread destruction of economic assets.
And it wasn't just about religion, right?
No, not at all. They incited various groups against each other. Hindus against Muslims, yes, but also the masses against the princes, and even one caste against another. Anything to augment internal divisions within the Hindu community itself. The goal was always to weaken any potential for unified resistance against their rule. We see this, for example, in their denial of the legitimacy of Muslim rulers like Sultan Tipu, or their use of propaganda to violate Hindu constitutional principles around land. Every division was a strategic opportunity.
This strategy became even more pronounced and arguably more cynical after the shocking 1857 mutiny. That event really shook them, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The British rulers were genuinely alarmed and deeply concerned by the unexpected unity shown by Hindu and Muslim soldiers during the rebellion, united around their shared loyalty to the Mughal prince. This profound fear spurred them to devise explicit policies and programs specifically designed to fracture these relationships. Initially, Muslims were heavily singled out. They were systematically ousted from positions of power and alienated, while Hindus were conspicuously favored.
Why target Muslims specifically at first?
It was a calculated move, intended to purge Muslims from the socio-political landscape because they had strongly protested and consistently challenged British imperial rules. They saw them as a primary source of resistance. The British even went so far as to exclude Muslims from their new English education policies, further ensuring they lagged behind economically and socially, while taking virtually no steps to bridge this growing disparity.
But the strategy wasn't static, was it? It shifted.
Exactly. The divide and rule strategy was incredibly fluid and adaptive, constantly shifting to suit changing circumstances. When the British became increasingly wary of the Indian National Congress's growing popularity, which by the late 19th and early 20th century carried strong nationalistic undertones and threatened unified resistance, they pivoted. They began actively appeasing the Muslim community, recognizing the urgent need to create a counterweight to the Congress's influence.
And figures like Syed Ahmed Khan played a role here.
A key role. He was later knighted for his services. He genuinely believed that cooperation with the British would benefit Muslims more strategically than aligning with Hindus in national agitations, advocating for a separate path. This led to a significant shift in British policy. Overt anti-Muslim attitudes waned, and, disturbingly, anti-Hindu policies began to subtly emerge. They were always playing one group off against the other.
A glaring, almost surgical example of this policy in action was the 1905 partition of Bengal. Can you tell us more about that?
Oh, that's a classic case. It wasn't merely an administrative reorganization, though that was the public rationale given by Lord Curzon. It was, as described, an astute project, explicitly intended to suppress the burgeoning spirit of Bengali intellectuals and drive a deep, lasting wedge between Hindus and Muslims by surgically separating largely Muslim eastern areas from largely Hindu western areas.
So administrative efficiency was just a cover story.
Largely, yes. While Curzon publicly stated the goal was efficiency, the true cynical objective was clearly to undermine any nascent unity and stifle the growing national movement in one of India's most politically vibrant regions. It was pure divide and rule.
So these policies were intentional, systematic, deeply manipulative. But what are the direct echoes of that specific policy in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh today? How deeply do those scars still run?
They run incredibly deep, permeating the social and political fabric even now. The Hindu-Muslim hostility, a direct and devastating consequence of this divide and rule policy, remains deeply prevalent in modern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. This antagonism frequently takes serious forms, directly contributing to the marginalization of religious minorities.
Yeah.
Muslims in India and Hindus in Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Can you give some examples of that marginalization?
Sure. We see this acutely in the declining Hindu population in Bangladesh. It plummeted from 22% in 1951 to a mere 8.4% in 2011. Many migrated to India specifically due to a perceived lack of security and systemic discrimination. Similarly, Hindus continue to leave Pakistan for India for analogous reasons, often citing insecurity and religious persecution. And in India, Muslims, as a significant minority group, are often subject to persecution and victimization. There are horrifying instances of harassment, torture, and even lynching by radical Hindu nationalist groups, often under the flimsiest suspicions like beef consumption. It's a living legacy of division.
It's crucial to acknowledge, though, that while the British legacy is undeniable in laying the groundwork for these divisions, holding them solely responsible for all present-day affairs would be unfair, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. That's a very important nuance. Post-colonial politicians in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh have also, unfortunately, exploited and used religion to fan the flames of hostility and garner votes, leading to disastrous consequences for the region and its people. The seeds were sown, yes, but they have been consistently watered by later hands.
And connecting this back to Galton's violence triangle, how does divide and rule manifest as a structural issue today?
Well, it becomes profoundly clear that divide and rule wasn't just a historical tactic. It became a deeply embedded structural issue. It continues to manifest today in ongoing conflicts like those in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, or CHT, in southeastern Bangladesh. This fuels both direct and cultural violence. Here, British colonizers explicitly implemented a tribalism policy. They divided the people of CHT into distinct categories: tribal hill people, often called Paharis, and Bengalis from the plains.
Why did they do that? What was the purpose?
It was done, quite nakedly, to ensure political control and facilitate the unrestrained economic exploitation of valuable resources like forests. It was about controlling people to control profits. Simple as that.
And tragically, the post-colonial Pakistani and then Bangladeshi governments, rather than dismantling these divisive structures, often inherited and perpetuated this colonial mindset, didn't they?
They did. They continued policies of aggressive land grabbing, forced displacement, and imposing dominant education and language on indigenous communities in CHT. This directly led to the continuation of various forms of violence, extending the colonial legacy well beyond political independence.
What kinds of violence are we talking about in the CHT?
We see clear and devastating instances of direct violence. There are documented cases of rape, arson, assault, kidnapping, and military violence against the Hilli Joma Nation. These brutal acts are often seen as a deliberate mechanism to force indigenous families from their traditional ancestral lands, clearing the way for Bengali settlers or development projects. But beyond the overt violence, post-colonial economic and development policies also contribute. Things like the Kaptai Electric Dam, which flooded vast indigenous lands, massive demographic and Bengali resettlement schemes, illegal or forceful land grabbing, and forced displacement for infrastructure projects.
So these create structural and cultural violence.
Exactly. They all contribute directly to structural and cultural violence. The imposition of a dominant education system and the Bengali language on CHT indigenous peoples affects not only their land rights and traditional practices, but also systematically erodes their cultures. This includes the disturbing practice of changing original indigenous place names to Bengali ones, and actively disturbing the Jumma people's celebration of their religious and cultural festivals and rituals. It's a continuous assault on their identity and way of life.
And the 1997 peace treaty, did that help?
Unfortunately, it ultimately proved to be little more than cosmetic. It looked good on paper, but in reality, almost 2 decades later, only 26 out of 72 clauses have been genuinely implemented. It utterly failed to resolve fundamental land disputes or truly recognize the cultural identity of the indigenous people. This invisible and enduring structural and cultural violence continues unabated through persistent Bengali resettlement politics, the ongoing military presence, and relentless infrastructure projects that prioritize the dominant group.
So, a peace treaty in name, but not really in practice.
Sadly, yes.
Moving on from the direct impact of division, let's explore another profound and insidious colonial tool: education. Before the British arrived, India had its own established education system, right? Even if it was decentralized.
It did. It was small, perhaps, compared to modern systems, but well organized for its time. Muslim children typically attended madrasas and maktabs, Islamic schools, while Hindu children were taught in pathshalas and tolls, Hindu educational institutions.
And what was taught there? Was it just religious instruction?
No, contrary to a common colonial narrative, these institutions offered a surprisingly diverse and rich curriculum. Subjects included Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, theology, grammar, logic, law, mathematics, metaphysics, medicine, and even astronomy and astrology. However, the British government largely disregarded this existing faith-based system. Instead, they systematically replaced it with a British model. This was a clear action that served a specific colonial motive the British government intended to fulfill by introducing English education into India. It wasn't about improving education per se, it was about control.
Interestingly, in the very early days, the British actually showed little genuine interest in Indian education or religious affairs. Why was that?
Their primary concern initially was simply not to interfere in a way that might endanger their burgeoning political and commercial ventures, keep things stable for business. Early on, they even founded institutions like Aliyah Madrasa in 1780 and Sanskrit College in 1823, ostensibly to provide Oriental education. They also established Fort William College in 1800, primarily for English officials to learn local languages.
But even those seemingly benign efforts had an ulterior motive.
Well, yes, they were still ultimately aimed at ensuring British domination and control, and keeping Hindus and Muslims quiescent, preventing any unified opposition. Understanding local systems helped control them.
The real turning point was this Anglicist versus Orientalist debate, wasn't it?
That was the crucial shift. Powerful British liberals and evangelicals strongly demanded the widespread introduction of British education, with English as the sole medium of instruction. This led to the formation of a Committee of Public Instruction, which was deeply divided. On one side were the Anglicists, who vehemently denigrated indigenous education as backward and inferior. On the other were the Orientalists, who argued, often out of a somewhat romanticized view, in its favor.
And it was Thomas Babington Macaulay who really pushed the Anglicist view.
Yes, he was incredibly influential. As a member of the Governor-General's Council, he tipped the scales decisively in favor of English education. In 1835, he delivered his influential recommendation, outlining a vision that perfectly encapsulates the entire colonial enterprise. He famously aimed to form a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect.
That quote is chilling. What was the idea behind creating this class?
His insidious idea was that this small, Western-educated elite class would then supposedly filter down knowledge to the masses. They would act as interpreters, administrators, a loyal buffer between the British rulers and the vast Indian populace.
So building directly on Macaulay's controversial recommendation, Lord William Bentinck, the Governor-General, officially introduced British education in India in March 1835.
Yes, and he simultaneously formalized this filtration model. The core idea was that English education would first be imparted exclusively to the upper classes, from whom we would then supposedly filter down to the broader population. Sir Charles Wood's dispatch, a significant policy statement in 1854, later reinforced this dual approach. It recommended English as the medium for higher education and local vernaculars for schools. This led to the founding of key universities in Kolkata, Bombay, and Madras, along with teacher training colleges and grade schools.
So the vision was incredibly clear. Create a loyal buffer class, fluent in English, immersed in British thought, culturally aligned with the colonizers. But how did this new education actually play out on the ground beyond the grand policy statements? Did it really filter down?
Well, from a qualitative perspective, the British-styled curriculum largely failed to bring about genuine transformative change in critical thinking or innovation. It mostly pushed learners into rote memorization.
Much like the older systems you mentioned.
Exactly. A method not entirely dissimilar to the pre-existing madrasa and pathshala systems, which also didn't actively encourage questioning or critical thinking in the way we might value today. And crucially, English education was never universal. It was designed only for a select group of Indian and British elites, explicitly excluding those from humbler backgrounds or rural areas. The filtering down largely didn't happen.
So it created more division.
Absolutely. This system fostered a palpable sense of superiority among the English-educated class, creating a profound division between those who received a British education and those who didn't. This not only encouraged a deeply ingrained class distinction, but also engendered antagonism among India's natives, weakening social cohesion and directly contributing toward fulfilling the British vision of domination and exploitation.
This raises that important question again. Was education truly the goal here, or was it simply a sophisticated tool for control and exploitation?
The evidence overwhelmingly points to the latter, I think. It created structural divisions that stubbornly persist today.
How so? How does that persistence manifest?
Well, the fundamental lack of uniformity and the deliberate creation of a dual education system by the British left, far-reaching, problematic effects. For example, while they introduced English education, they consciously chose not to abolish the traditional madrasa system. This created a dual education system that continues to cause unrest and tension. Students in mainstream institutions, often from more privileged backgrounds, frequently view themselves as intellectually superior to those in madrasas.
And the madrasa students.
They, in turn, often claim superior theological knowledge or moral standing. This creates a cycle of mutual suspicion and hostility, perpetuating divides that were essentially baked into the system by the British.
And what's particularly troubling is the potential link this dual system can have to radicalization. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, it's a complex and sensitive issue. Records indicate that madrasa students, often from poorer backgrounds and with limited alternative opportunities, have sometimes been found more vulnerable to violent radicalization. Some studies even suggest that during Ziaul Haq's regime in Pakistan, madrasa students indoctrinated with jihadi ideology were sent to Afghanistan to fight Soviet occupiers, with textbooks explicitly developed to inspire holy war. This suggests external manipulation for political ends, not just an inherent issue with the education itself.
But it's not just madrasa students, right? That would be too simplistic.
Absolutely vital point. Radicalization isn't confined to madrasas. We've seen, tragically, that students from private universities and English medium schools, often from economically solvent families, heavily engaged with the internet and social media, have also been found radicalized. The 2016 Holy Artisan Bakery attack in Dhaka is a stark and chilling example. 5 of the 6 terrorists were identified as private university students with English medium education backgrounds. Only 1 was schooled in a madrasa.
That's a critical distinction, and it contrasts sharply with mainstream Bengali-educated graduates who you said are very rarely radicalized.
Correct. It suggests something deeper is at play than just the type of school attended. It points towards broader societal issues, perhaps alienation, or access to certain online ideologies.
And the situation highlights a persistent structural inequality, too, doesn't it? In terms of job prospects, for instance.
Yes, exactly. Most employers today overtly prefer general or English medium students over madrasa graduates. This subtly but powerfully continues the British class distinction. This isn't just about individual hiring biases. It's about how the very structure of our education system continues to devalue one form of knowledge and one group's identity. It perpetuates structural inequality.
And that's a form of cultural violence.
Precisely. Cultural violence, where one group's identity and skills are implicitly deemed less than, impacting their life chances. These non-mainstream students, who aren't formally trained in national values and cultures through the mainstream system, can sometimes feel less connected to the idea of the nation and country. In extreme cases, this might contribute to their vulnerability to radicalization.
You mentioned Paulo Freire's banking education model earlier. How does that apply here?
It applies perfectly. Freire described a system where knowledge is simply deposited into students, treating them like empty vessels rather than active participants in their own learning. The British system largely adopted this approach. It ignored students' pre-existing knowledge and made them passive recipients. This form of indoctrination imposed an undue strain on students, making it difficult for them to express their own ideas, particularly in a foreign language like English.
So fundamentally, British education in India was designed for profit.
That's a strong argument. To create Calibans, a direct, stark reference to Shakespeare's enslaved, exploited character from The Tempest, these individuals were essentially groomed to be cheap administrative labor and sources of local information, ensuring the economic machinery of colonialism ran smoothly. They were meant to help produce and consume European goods.
Yet, within this largely negative picture, there's that compelling counter-narrative to consider. The idea that English education for some was actually empowering.
Yes, and it's important not to dismiss that. For a certain segment of the Indian population, learning English and gaining access to Western knowledge did prove to be an unexpected source of empowerment. It enabled them to become acutely aware of their rights, to engage with Enlightenment ideals of liberty and self-determination, and to articulate powerful demands for freedom. Ultimately, this knowledge contributed directly to the independence movement.
So the tool of oppression ironically became a tool for liberation for some.
In a way, yes. After 90 long years of direct British rule, that very education helped fuel the movement that successfully reclaimed their land from the colonial masters.
But despite this empowerment for a select few, the overall policy was one of subjugation.
Fundamentally, yes. The colonial education policy imposed English as the dominant language, systematically subjugated local languages, and deliberately created that buffer class to serve the colonists. This language subjugation is a clear, pervasive component of structural and cultural violence, and the legacy continues.
How does it continue today?
Well, in Bangladesh, dominant Bengali is imposed on CHT indigenous people, whose own rich languages remain largely unrecognized and unsupported. And in India and Pakistan, English stubbornly remains an official language in most higher educational institutions and the judicial system, despite ongoing demands for mother tongue education and the recognition of diverse regional languages. The linguistic landscape still bears the deep imprint of this colonial imposition.
Okay, let's move to our final pillar. The British Raj and the law, another incredibly potent yet often subtly wielded instrument of power. The British asserted repeatedly that their empire rested on justice, didn't they?
They did. They claimed their empire rested on the principle of justice and that England maintained supremacy through it. They famously stated, "Without justice, we could not hold India for a moment." That was their high-minded justification.
But how did it work in practice initially?
Well, initially, codified English law applied only to Europeans. But by 1773, a significant bifurcation was proposed. Islamic law would apply to Muslims and Hindu law to Hindus in highly personal matters, marriage, inheritance, religious practices.
Was this an early divide and rule tactic in the legal sphere?
It's hard to say definitively if that was the explicit intent documented at the time, but its long-lasting impacts certainly contributed to the eventual division of the subcontinent along religious lines. It reinforced those separate identities within the legal framework. What's often overlooked is that for the first 150 years, colonial masters even deferred to indigenous laws. In some cases, they almost romanticized them, commissioning translations of key religious texts like Fatawa al-Maghiri, Hidayah, and Dharmasastra. They initially saw value in understanding and, well, leveraging existing systems.
But this didn't last. They became disillusioned.
That romanticization, if it ever truly was that, was incredibly short-lived. British figures like the philosopher James Mill openly viewed indigenous laws as disorderly and unintelligible, embodying a distinctly colonial arrogance. This disillusionment, or perhaps more accurately this shift in strategy, stemmed partly from the sheer logical challenge. Trying to categorize the diverse and fluid religious identities within Hinduism and Islam into a single, uniform Western legal code. It was a task inherently bound to fail, given the multitude of schools of thought, regional variations, and sub-schools within each tradition.
Were there other interpretations for this shift away from religious law?
Yes, there are alternative views. Replacing religious law with Western positivist law in the public sphere could have been an attempt to legitimize British rule, to appear more modern and accountable to the native population, effectively becoming prisoners of their own rhetoric about justice. However, detractors fiercely argued that India simply became a laboratory for the British, a place for them to experiment with legal test tubes, developing new legal frameworks and administrative techniques before potentially implementing them back home or elsewhere. More about opportunity than justice.
And the 1857 rebellion marked another turning point legally.
Absolutely. After that failed rebellion, which profoundly shook the British establishment, the 1858 British India Act transferred power directly from the East India Company to the British Crown. This established more formal, centralized, and complete control. The act also created a new office, the Secretary of State for India, advised by a 15-member council in London, signifying a direct assertion of imperial authority over legal and administrative matters.
And what happened to religious law then?
Following this transfer, the British actively began a systematic purge of religion from criminal law entirely, and partially from civil law. The 1860 Indian Penal Code is a key example. It conspicuously outlawed adultery and fornication, and notably struck down corporal punishment for women in cases of adultery provisions that were part of the existing Sharia law they were replacing.
Interesting. Any other notable aspects of that penal code?
Well, Section 506, which provided jail terms for insulting the modesty of women, remains, in various forms, in modern penal codes across the subcontinent today. Its legacy is complex. It could be viewed as paternalistic, an attempt to impose Victorian morality, or, as some argue, perhaps even a deliberate tool to emasculate men by legally elevating the status of women in certain contexts, creating social friction. Justice Willie Brennan had a famous quote about romantic paternalism, putting women not on a pedestal but in a cage.
When we examine this proclaimed principle of justice, what's the most striking contradiction that emerges for you? It truly sounds like justice had drastically different rules depending on who you were, almost a cynical manipulation. What's your key takeaway on this aspect?
The cynicism is palpable, really. A truly key change, a stark example, came with the 1862 Code of Criminal Procedure. This was explicitly, unapologetically discriminatory. It prohibited Indian judges from issuing arrest warrants or indicting Europeans. Think about that. Furthermore, it stipulated that only British-born judges could try cases involving British accused persons.
And for serious cases.
For cases carrying the death penalty, the accused Briton had the right to a jury, half of whom had to be British-born. This was undeniably a clear and blatant digression from the principle of justice that the British so loudly proclaimed. It was justice for the colonizer, absolutely, but not for the colonized.
By the turn of the 20th century, say from 1900 to 1947, as Indian nationalism began to stir more forcefully, the British employed what could only be described as a set of illegal laws, laws that fundamentally undermined basic rights. It was that carrot and stick approach again.
Exactly, a classic carrot and stick policy. On one hand, they created the Indian Civil Services, attempting to control Indians through educated locals within the bureaucracy, the carrot. But on the other hand, they unleashed a barrage of ruthless legislation, the stick.
Can you give an example of that ruthless legislation?
Oh, definitely. Take the 1901 Frontier Crimes Regulation, or FCR, a truly draconian law that operated outside the normal judicial system, particularly on the frontiers. It allowed for abhorrent punishments like whipping for certain crimes, including homosexuality, and starkly barred civil courts from hearing cases. But perhaps most chillingly, it held entire tribes or villages collectively accountable for individual acts.
Collective punishment.
Yes, allowing for mass property seizure and demolition, essentially punishing innocent communities for the actions of a few, a terrifying tool for control. And this wasn't an isolated incident. The 1910 Indian Press Act outlawed any publications that incited hatred or contempt against the crown or government, effectively muzzling dissent. And the 1911 Prevention of Seditious Meetings Act gave magistrates arbitrary power to prohibit any public gathering deemed likely to promote sedition or disaffection.
And the legacy of these laws.
Tragically, these laws or their underlying principles and mechanisms of control are still operative in places like Pakistan today. Section 144 on public gatherings, restrictions on free speech, they're used by modern rulers for political reasons or to oppress dissidents, showcasing a direct, enduring legal legacy of the Raj.
Despite this repression, there were also gestures towards power sharing, weren't there? Like the Minto-Morley reforms.
Yes, albeit incredibly limited and perhaps, as you noted, another subtle divisive tactic. The 1908-1909 Minto-Morley reforms allowed Indians to be elected to legislative councils, a seeming step towards representation. While the Crown still reserved ultimate central power, provinces could elect native majorities. Crucially, these reforms also granted Muslims the right to a separate electorate.
So was this true power sharing or another strategic move to divide emerging political forces along religious lines?
That interpretation remains a contentious historical debate. It certainly reinforced religious identity as a political category, which had profound consequences later on.
The real watershed moment for draconian laws leading to direct violence was the Rowlatt Acts, right?
Undoubtedly. The Wallet Acts of 1918 and 1919, enacted immediately after World War I, were brutal. They gave authorities sweeping powers: arrest without warrant, indefinite detention without trial, no confrontation with accusers. They were clearly designed to crush Gandhi's emerging satyagraha, his nonviolent resistance movement, and the pan-Islamic Khilafat movement, which were both gaining momentum.
And this led directly to Jallianwala Bagh.
Yes. This severe repression culminated in the tragic Jallianwala Bagh massacre on April 13, 1919. General Dyer ordered firing on a crowd of 10,000 unarmed protesters, including women and children, who had gathered peacefully in an enclosed garden in Amritsar. Nearly 400 people were killed. This horrific event profoundly shocked India, significantly weakened the British moral and political position, and arguably contributed directly to the eventual enactment of the 1935 Government of India Act, as pressure for reform intensified.
Tell us about the 1935 Act. That was a major piece of legislation.
It was. Despite its limitations, the 1935 Government of India Act was a significant legal milestone. It provided for devolved provincial powers and substantial autonomy, though London still retained tight control over federal affairs like defense and foreign policy. The 1937 elections held under this act resulted in a sweeping victory for the Indian National Congress. This deeply alarmed the Muslim League, who feared a Hindu tyranny if the British eventually left, reinforcing their demand for a separate Muslim state, Pakistan.
And that act had a life after independence, too.
Yes. Notably, this act, with minor modifications, served as the de facto constitution for the newly formed state of Pakistan for several years after independence in 1947.
So, fast forward to the endgame. What was the final legal plan from the British?
The final legal plan by the significantly weakened British Raj, exhausted by World War II and facing increasing internal pressure, was the 1946 Cabinet Mission. It proposed a united all-Indian Union divided into 3 provincial clusters, based roughly on religious majorities, hoping to keep India whole while acknowledging the divisions, a complex 3-tiered structure.
How was it received?
Well, while the Muslim League initially agreed to this complex plan, Jawaharlal Nehru and the Indian National Congress eventually rejected it. This rejection reinforced the League's belief that Hindus would never genuinely share power with Muslims in a united India. This ultimate failure to agree, coupled with escalating communal violence, led directly to the decision to partition, creating independent India and Pakistan in August 1947, a partition that resulted in immense human suffering, displacement, and death.
So, how do we truly view this incredibly complex legal legacy? Was it purely negative, stripping away indigenous systems, imposing foreign control? Or were there unexpected positive aspects, even if unintended?
It's genuinely both, and acknowledging this duality is crucial to understanding the full picture. On the negative side, British positivist law arguably destroyed swift, locally acceptable justice systems, replacing them with a bureaucratic, convoluted, and red tape-laden system that was often inaccessible and alienating to the common person.
But the counter-argument.
The counter-argument is that some indigenous practices could be inherently unfair, particularly to women. Examples like the Jirga system in tribal areas or Wani, giving girls in marriage to settle disputes, are often cited. Despite their flaws and their primary design for colonial control, British laws ultimately wrested power from ruling monarchs and contributed, perhaps inadvertently, to establishing the groundwork for modern democracy, however flawed it may still be in practice.
And what about social reforms?
They are also widely credited with significant social reforms, like the banning of sati, widow immolation, permitting widow remarriage, and passing the 1910 Child Act, fixing the age of majority at 18. However, it's crucial to note these reforms were often heavily influenced by powerful internal social movements and progressive Indian figures like Raja Ram Mohan Roy. They weren't solely a gift from the British.
And the concept of the rule of law.
Yes, the very concept of the rule of law, a direct legacy of the Raj, is seen by many as providing at least a modicum of security. A framework, however imperfectly applied, for individuals to establish and defend their rights within a structured legal system.
So, connecting this to the bigger picture again, we see this dual nature, designed for control, but ironically laying some groundwork for rights and democracy, even if unintended.
Exactly, that's the paradox. They were designed for control and exploitation, yet they also contain seeds, perhaps unintended, for individual rights and democratic processes.
And critically, many of these draconian British laws from the Raj, the 1862 Code of Criminal Procedure, the FCR, the Press Act, Seditious Meetings Act, the Rollout Act, they didn't just disappear, did they?
No. Absolutely not. Many of them providing vast, unchecked power to rulers and fueling both direct and structural violence are still present and operative in today's criminal justice systems across the subcontinent. Bangladesh, for instance, still directly inherits its penal code, criminal procedure code, police code, jail code, and evidence act almost verbatim from the British Raj.
That's staggering. People's lives today governed by laws crafted for colonial control decades, even centuries ago.
It really is. And despite 70 years or more of independence, political elites in modern nations often exhibit a profound resistance to enacting new laws that genuinely cater to indigenous needs and dismantle these colonial-era structures.
Why is that? Why keep these old laws?
Well, a UNDP police reform project in Bangladesh, for example, despite its promising goals, has simply not been implemented. Why? Because these colonial laws remain incredibly useful tools for current governments. They use them to oppress dissent, stifle opposition, and govern with alarming immunity and impunity, allowing them to bypass genuine democratic accountability. They serve the rulers, not necessarily the ruled.
So the ultimate responsibility lies elsewhere now.
Absolutely. The profound responsibility to enact new laws that truly cater to the needs of their indigenous people, to break free from this inherited legal straitjacket, lies squarely with the elected representatives of Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan today.
As we wrap up this deep dive, it becomes strikingly clear how these three interconnected prongs, the deliberate divide and rule strategy, the shaping power of colonial education, and the instruments of British law were not merely separate policies. They were intricately woven tools of subjugation and profound division. These mechanisms weren't just about direct military conquest. They expertly created and perpetuated deep-seated structural, cultural, and direct violence that fundamentally altered India's social structures and its very institutions.
Indeed. The British conquest didn't just impose new rule, it broke India's basic institutions and self-sufficient village systems in unprecedented ways, dismantling local autonomy and economic self-reliance. We see long-term consequences even today, such as varied public goods investment in formerly directly ruled versus indirectly ruled areas. Directly ruled areas, for example, often experience consistently lower investment due to heavy taxation and brutal resource extraction, leaving a lasting impact on development trajectories.
And things like famines.
Famines, often presented as purely natural disasters, were sometimes deliberately exacerbated or even, arguably, created by colonizers' policies. Think about resource extraction, forced cultivation of cash crops over food crops, and then relief work often conveniently served British economic interests by building infrastructure like railways for goods transport, further deepening exploitation under the guise of aid.
It's a truly complex picture, isn't it? Not easily painted and just black and white.
Definitely not. While the impact was predominantly negative, some British measures did have unexpected, albeit often unintended, side effects that proved beneficial in certain ways. Learning English, as we discussed for a select few, became an empowering tool, opening doors to global knowledge and enabling powerful articulation of their rights.
And those social reforms.
Credit must be given for certain social reforms, like banning sati, even if heavily influenced by powerful internal social movements led by Indian reformers. We shouldn't erase their agency. And the British faced significant widespread resistance throughout their rule. Ironically, their repressive measures often inadvertently strengthened and empowered movements like Gandhi's nonviolent resistance. This ultimately culminated in their departure in 1947, transforming the cynical divide and rule into a somewhat reluctant divide and depart.
Yet, despite achieving political independence, the profound legacy of these policies continues to fuel conflicts today, doesn't it?
Tragically, yes. In volatile regions like Kashmir, the bustling port city of Karachi, and the ecologically rich Chittagong Hill Tracts, the echoes of these divisions continue to claim lives and lead to human rights abuses. This highlights a crucial point. Post-colonial states must not, by action or inaction, sustain the legacy of British colonial policy. They shouldn't continue forced assimilation, division, and subjugation by imposing dominant languages, religions, and cultures against their own ethnic and religious minorities.
So genuine peace building is essential.
Not just desirable, absolutely imperative. Genuine, comprehensive peace-building approaches are needed to address these ongoing, deeply entrenched divides inherited from the colonial era.
So what does this all mean for us, for you listening? Given this deep dive into colonialism's pervasive and often invisible violence, What profound responsibility do post-colonial nations and indeed even societies globally still grappling with legacies of past injustices have? What responsibility do we have to genuinely address these deep-seated historical divisions and move towards authentic, positive peace, rather than simply maintaining, consciously or unconsciously, systems of control that echo the past? It's a question worth reflecting on deeply, isn't it? How can true knowledge of these historical mechanics profoundly inform and inspire contemporary approaches to social justice, reconciliation, and ultimately building a more equitable future for everyone? Something to think about.